He's here to tell us about the central application system that will be implemented for all public universities and TVET colleges in South Africa. So over to you, Marc.
Great, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Sorry, I feel a little awkward with this thing in front of me, so bear with me. Yes, thank you very much all. I just wanted to check you're all IT technology staff. Is that more or less, have I got that right? So what we're going to talk about is an initiative that is undertaken by the Department of Higher Education and Training to establish a central application service for the post-school education and training sector. The post-school education and training sector is a broad sector and broader than just universities. So I will focus a little bit more on universities for today, but it in the long term will be a broader section. I'll give you an overview of the service with a little bit of a flavor of what the technology will be, and I'll give you a hint of how this program will progress in due course, so that you've got a sense of when and at what point engagement around more technical matters will occur. But hopefully it'll give you a nice background and a sense of what this is all about. I'm also going to give you a view on what is the architecture, the enterprise architecture, because that's the phase at which we're at. So we're at a very early phase of this central application service. And really what we've tried to do so far is to define the concept of a vision of this future organization, this central application service, and put that into a design document that then defines how that entity, how that business, as it were, should operate, how it should be structured, and how it should be supported with technology and processes. It's very much about how this thing is intended and envisioned to operate. Okay. Now, obviously, it's a central application service, lots of technology about it, and that's at the heart of it. But the phase that we're at is what would it take for this entity to operate? And we've tackled this. I'm actually with Learning Strategies. We're the consulting firm that was appointed by the department to assist them in this work. And so we've put this document together. The document that our deliverable is in fact publicly available. I'll give you a sense of where you could find it later down the presentation. And what we've tried to do is to talk about a number of different dimensions of this entity through its service model, through what its governance, its standard operating practices, its ICT architecture would be, and what its human resource management practices would be, and how it should be supported with concepts of advocacy and communication, with stakeholder management, with monitoring and evaluation, and ultimately what would be an implementation plan and what are cost estimates to run it. This will now be used by the department for a number of things. One is to actually initiate the legal processes to establish this as a public entity. Okay, this has to go through a law passed through Parliament with policy frameworks, actual bills to be passed, and so forth. Secondly, there's a whole process envisaged to define this architecture into lower levels of detail, and that's a phase that the department is about to embark on now. So this is really quite an early phase. To give you a sense of what this is about, the Central Application Service, its concept is about essentially a bridge between two groups of people, entities, and so forth. On the one hand, you've got the applicants who want to apply to study at a university or a TVET college, or even a learnership through a CETA. On the other side, you have the institutions who want to admit those applicants, who want to select them, who want to make them offers, and ultimately register and admit those students into their institutions. Okay, and it's very important that that process stays. That process of admitting students, selecting them, is very important and will stay for the universities and colleges. It might operate slightly different in the community colleges, where it's typically more of a arrive and register. There isn't a selection and admission process to the same extent at the universities. The Central Application Service then facilitates the process of the applications placed by applicants to the institutions, and does a two-way process to make sure that as decisions are made or as statuses of an application change, that the applicant is aware of that. It also facilitates that for multiple institutions. So it's a bridge between an applicant, many of them, and institutions, and many of them. And then lastly, it will also provide a mechanism that students who are not placed, who are not made offers, who are being regretted, are channeled into other opportunities through which they might find learning opportunities. Okay? So it's a more proactive way of trying to place students into the sector and to avoid some of the problems that we have now. So in terms of what the various entities would do, the applicants would investigate opportunities, they would prepare their application, they would submit it. They probably, and many of them, would change it. We found evidence of that. They would provide additional information, particularly if an institution like a university requires something additional to make a selection decision. And ultimately, they would consider and accept offers. The central service would prepare the application cycles. It would capture offline applications. So we do anticipate that this is not just a digital platform. They would check applications, make sure that they're actually complete. Is everything completed? Are all the supporting documents, if there are any required, are they all there? They would submit the application to the institutions to which the applicant has applied. They would communicate with the applicants through SMS or email or other mechanisms. They would resolve applicant queries. Applicants who come in and say, well, what's happening with my application? They would try to address that. And they would refer regretted applications, or regretted applicants rather, to other institutions to whom that applicant might be suitable. The institutions themselves would prepare the program data. They would indicate in advance what are all the programs to which that institution wants to receive applications. They would request additional information if that's required for a particular applicant or for a particular program. They would update application statuses. So once they've received applications, they would consider them and start saying, well, okay, well, these applicants perhaps might be on a waiting list. These might be on a conditional or provisional offer to be accepted, or these are properly accepted. They would ultimately select and make offers, and they would last at the final stages register and admit students. Okay? So the concept of this central application service is very much about an entity that will provide a facilitation between many applicants and many institutions. And it changes the interaction between applicants and the institutions as it happens now. Okay? Just want to take a pause. If there's any kind of key questions of clarification that perhaps I could ask now, and then we can drill into a little bit more detail. No? So this is a concept, and as I said, we've now built up an enterprise architecture for that concept. It's structured in a 600-page document of 11 chapters together with an executive summary. It covers many aspects of what that entity would be, and I'm just putting this up to give you a sense of all the work that's been done. We've received quite a bit of input into the architecture through direct engagement with a fairly large group of people. We've had direct impact from higher education South Africa, from some of the universities directly, through DHET from some of the other types of colleges that are out there. The department took a study tour to UCAS and the Ireland CAO, which are equivalent organizations that have been in existence for many years in the UK and in Ireland, as well as the KwaZulu-Natal Central Application Office. For those of you who operate in the KZN base would be familiar with the CAO. And really, if you look at the history of how this thing evolved, it was triggered in many respects by a sense that we would like to take the concept of the KwaZulu-Natal CAO and expand it into the broader sector. So it's very much anchored onto that concept. There's quite a good governance forums that is in place with representation from many of the other sectors, and that will continue and in fact increase. The architecture has been validated through the project's governance structures, and ultimately the architecture was submitted to the minister in March and was approved by the minister on the 31st of March. So it's now in principle, but formally approved to proceed into the next phases. And it's been published on the DHET website at the address over there. And perhaps, Val, if it's of interest to people, perhaps you could distribute that URL to people. So that URL contains the detailed documentation that has been published. It's publicly available, and I'm giving you just a summary of all of that. The architecture has also been presented at regional visits in all of the regions. Some of you may have been at some of those sessions. I'm not sure if you have, but you'll recognize some of the materials. So we've gone now through the process of trying to engage with all the institutions that are out there to give them a sense of what's coming, so that they can start getting prepared for it. It's also important to understand that this is a long-term project. The universities were looking at a time to launch between 2 to 5 years. It's not immediate. It's not a long time either. I do recognize that. But there is some time to build up to this. TVET colleges is 4 years out, community colleges 5 years out, and CETAs are about 6 years old. So depending on the institution, there's also a much longer window along which this becomes relevant to your types of institution. And certainly the level of engagement at universities has been higher than at other institution types. In terms of the target market, we're talking about all entering undergraduates who submit applications to enter into an undergraduate program in the PSET sector, leading to an NQF approved qualification from a PSET institution that the applicant has not previously attended. I know it's a wordy sentence. Okay, we're trying to look at those who are coming into an institution for the first time. And the applications will be for programs as specified for the institution to which they're applying. So the institutions may then enroll or admit at a more detailed level. Okay, so it's to pass an application to the institution, who then may select, and then when they register, may capture more information that's relevant to that institution or require more information for the application. So, for instance, in a music program, you may well want some sort of portfolio. We're not expecting that will be submitted at the date when the application's first submitted. The target market specifically then excludes returning students and recommencement of previously registered academic programs. So once a student is associated with an institution, that relationship is then direct. We're not expecting that applicant to then go back to the CAS to apply again if they want to recommence a study. We're not looking at postgraduate students because the requirements for that are far more unique. And also are far more relevant to universities only. We're not talking about unregistered courses or short courses that are not linked to an NQF, or any program that does not lead to an NQF approved qualification. We're not looking at transfers between institutions. So a student who's applied successfully into an institution, completes a year, completes a second year, and then wants to go to an equivalent course at another institution, that's a more unique transaction between those institutions. We're not dealing, with conversions to another course within the same institution. So the applicant is in the institution, now wants to do something else. We're not expecting to go back into the CAS to apply to that. I'll run through some of the principles. Policy and legislative remains the responsibility of DHET. DHET should be responsible for compliance with the implementation. So this is a national initiative. It will be legislated. There is expected to be compliance. And it should be compulsory for all applications to PSET institutions and CETAs. So it's not voluntary participation by institutions. And all the institutions, or certainly all the sectors, have acknowledged that is the intent. Its focus of the service is about applications handling, not admission. Final admission decisions rest with the institutions. That's a very, very important principle. This is not intended to take away the admission decisions that are currently made by institutions. The target market we've defined. It's a single point of information and access into the PSET, similar to what's currently in place in the Central Application Clearinghouse. And the final objective is one application, one fee, an affordable application fee where one application could be to multiple institutions or programs. And through that one application, also do an integrated application for study, learnerships, apprenticeships, scholarships, student housing, and funding. Okay, so you apply. For programs, you might indicate that you require funding, particularly for nationally administered funding. You might indicate that you want to apply for student housing if that's relevant for that institution and or program. And the funding, we're looking at funding from both NSFAS and other sources, including funding from the institutions. Now, that could be as simple as saying, as indicating a requirement for funding, okay, and then leave that, for instance, up to the institution to determine, well, let me put those applicants into the pot for available funding, okay, and it might require follow-up to that particular applicant. An important principle for the institutions, a level of visibility of selection and offering by institutions, and that's intended to give institutions, and this is one of the key benefits, institutions insight into who's applied, who's accepted what, and is this open application or offered application actually going to be taken up? We understand that many institutions face the issue that they've made an offer to a candidate, 2 other universities have done the same, and then we don't know where that student's actually going to turn up on the day, and you then have lost places which then need to be filled at the last moment. We're trying to avoid that kind of thing without necessarily creating other selection discrepancies. And we've agreed particularly with the university registrars, that we will engage deeply with the universities to define what the rules would be. We're talking about the full cycle from application through status changes throughout the application life cycle, and then finally confirmed offer and acceptance, and actually registration. So we're looking to be able to understand that full cycle. It's to resolve or at least substantially address the multiple acceptances and registration uncertainty. Talked about that briefly. We're ultimately looking to achieve a single database of all applications and applicants. And that's important for the department and for government broadly from policy and planning perspectives, but also for the universities. We think it will be very useful. A seamless transfer of data between the CAS, the institutions, and the applicants. We're looking to receive feedback of walk-in students. We do recognize that the concept of a walk-in student is one that all institutions, particularly the universities and the TVET colleges, are trying to avoid. But certainly at skill centers and community colleges down the track, we expect that there will be still the concept of a walk-in, someone who arrives, registers, and is admitted all in one step. Once an institution selects a student, the communication then really transitions between the institution and the applicant, with the CAS providing assistance if that's required, and for certain aspects of the application. And then the last principle, the CAS should be self-funding. We have recognized this principle was established in around about July last year. A few things have happened, particularly in the universities since then. We have prepared a position paper on what this would look like if there was a principle of zero application fee, or how that could be handled. That position paper is being considered by the department. But as it stands, the concept is one of self-funding, where an application fee is raised by the CAS, and that is then used to fund its own operation. Okay. Right, I am conscious we have time until 20 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to speed up through some of the things. All of this information is in the documents. So if you want to read up further, you'll be able to find the documents. But I'll give you a sense of what is out there. So we've developed an operating model that tries to define what falls within the scope of the CAS if we look at the principle. So it's all the way from policy and legislation through program definition, outreach and training, outreach to students at schools, etc., of how they should go about applying, training to the institutions about how the processes will work, particularly in the initial launch phases. The actual application handling, that's the core of the service, and then integrated with funding, particularly NSFAS institutions. At the end of the cycle, clearinghouse and registry and application closing, the clearinghouse to try to place students who are not placed anywhere. Okay? Try to do so earlier than what is currently known, because it's really right at the end. We're trying to do it more proactively. And then ultimately reporting, monitoring, and evaluation. There will be integration with career development services and guidance services, and there will be two-way communication with applicants. In terms of structure for this entity, it is intended to be a public entity with its own board, with representation from the sector as board members, with then the services contained within the public entity, but with the opportunity of contracting those services where that's appropriate. So some of the services we do anticipate will be contracted to service providers. That could be, for instance, running the outreach and distribution, because it's a regional type service. It would have a cloud-based hosted central database and application handling system that would be accessible to everyone. And it would then integrate and interface with a number of different types of entities for information. So information sources such as the DBE, IEB, to obtain information about applicants. The institutions themselves, the funders, Department of Home Affairs to try to automate ID validation, SARS to try to automate income validation. So one of the visions of this of the service is to take out many of the processes that you do as part of your admission process, and you all do, and to bring it in further, and to bring it in earlier, so that you can rely on the fact that this applicant has an ID, it is valid, it gels. That the information that you receive around results is in fact accurate and you can trust, so that you don't have to go and rely on pieces of paper necessarily to check that everything is in there. In terms of governance, as I said, a public entity with a board, 2 executive directors, 13 non-executives from the sector. It would have its own policies as a public entity, and it would run advisory committees and user groups that would guide it into its activity. It's funded by Parliament via the department, as well as its own funds, and that's kind of a generic statement. The own funds is meant to be the predominant source of funding once it's fully operational, but certainly to seed the establishment of it, there will be considerable funding from the department required to get this thing up and running. Responsibilities, DHET would still be policy and compliance, CAS would be operational execution of application handling, and the institutions would be program definition, advising upfront what programs you're planning to run in a particular cycle, and then selection and admission in line with sector agreed standards and milestones. And we do anticipate to try, and we have agreed this with the registrar, to try to bring an element of standardization in terms used and in approaches and in milestones to make sure that the application process is certainly within a sector consistent. Right, I'm going to flash up a couple of the next slides just to give you a sense. We've now put together a business architecture with either process maps or protocols or scripts for the different aspects of the process. So, for instance, protocols for outreach and promotion and training, process maps for the application handling process and the program information, scripts for call centers and so forth. Lots of detail that's being built. I'm not going to go into more of that. We anticipate an organization structure of a board with a CEO, an operations officer, a chief operations officer where all the operational functions will reside, CFO for the administration, IT for the systems and system support, marketing and outreach to go out to applicants or potential applicants. Remember, these are, and you know this, these are new students every year. We've got a new cohort predominantly coming in every year, and they need to be advised of how to go about it. And then planning and monitoring evaluation. In terms of the ICT architecture, at the heart of it, and this is where it's important to collaborate with all of the institutions, a comprehensive program information on a central program database, information regarding the program, regarding the institution offering the program, making clear the minimum entrance requirements, and making clear the costs of the program. This is information that will have to come from the institutions and be prepared to be provided at the start of an application cycle. We're looking for standardized terminology, status and conditions, clearly defined, easily understood by applicants, and consistent across the PSET, so that if we have a status that says provisional offer, well, we all know what that means, and it's consistent. That's our objective. We will have to work hard within the sector to achieve that in due course. Online applications, we do have a drive for achieving as great a number of online applications as we are able to achieve, and the statistics that we've seen so far is that we're actually, the institutions, particularly the universities, are making excellent progress towards that. Where an average online application over the last cycle was achieved of 75%, which is a pretty high percentage. And if you look at the institutions that if you exclude the institutions that don't offer online, obviously that number improves even better. So there's some institutions for whom it's not possible to offer online applications. Online applications via PC, but also mobile devices. So simple application processes that can be done on mobile devices that are geared to what the applicants have available to them. And then key unique identification of the applicant and the application, so that it's very clear that Joe, who's applied for these and these things, and when Joe calls in to find out what's going on, well, we can find Joe. Okay, so there has to be identities. The obvious one is obviously the national ID number, which won't cover all applicants, but hopefully a large number of the applicants. But we'd have to again engage with universities and colleges to determine what would work for each of the players in this field. In terms of the overall architecture, I'm not going to go into detail. I know this might be of interest to you, but I really refer you into the documentation. But we're anticipating an architecture that consists at the heart a CAS application and workflow engine with a program database to support it. That's the heart of it. That's where all the action will happen. Enabled and for usage through a web front end, a mobile front end, a CAS front end for CAS employees and professionals to manage the applications, and then an institution front end to be able to view applications if that is what you need to do, or actually engage directly with the CAS system. Supported by technologies, content manager, scanning systems, document managers, finance system to manage the payments, SMS and email services, user directory, contact center integration, finance and SME, and HR and payroll systems. All the components that make up the systems for that entity. And then using a sophisticated integration layer to connect that CAS application system bidirectionally with lots of other information holders. So career development sites, so that if you land on a career development site, you could be linked directly to the CAS site to say, I now want to do an application. Or if you land on CAS and you realize that you need career advice, well, we'll link you back to a host of career sites that you could go, that you could get helped with, and so forth. Integration with information sources about results, DBE, IEB, CIE, and ideally also the SACWA NLRD database, so that as part of the application process, available information is pulled into the application and passed along. Where information is available only after, so DBE results or IEB results, they get loaded up, they get provided to you as soon as they're available. Integrate it once so that the integration happens only in one place and can be done properly. Integration with NSFAS, NSF, and potentially in the long term other funding sources so that they could receive applications and consider those applications. Integration with the various student admin systems, ITS, PeopleSoft, Coltech, the CETA systems, and there are probably a few more out there that we plan to integrate. And again, we have a vision there because there are a couple of standard systems out there that we will also try to engage with the system providers directly so that we do integration once for everyone rather than each institution having to deal with it. But that's our goal. Integration in an open basis so that there's open web services, open flat files that could be used by sources. Integration with Home Affairs and ideally SARS to leverage information that they have. So if an ID is provided, that we obtain that information, then all the supporting information directly from Home Affairs, from the register. Integration with banks, EasyPay, Payat as mechanisms for handling payments. Okay, so this is what we have. A very quick overview of what is intended to be in place in due course. We've developed an implementation plan, which has a couple of key assumptions. One, it's based on the enterprise architecture. We've got to start with something. It's a phased implementation, starting with a smaller group of universities and then gradually broadening out. An assumption about the location of the CAS, which is envisaged to be based in Gauteng, where it's close to many of the educational higher education organizations. It's linked to the establishment of a public entity. This has to go through Parliament. There are timeframes associated with it, and the entity can only be established when the laws has been promulgated. Assumption of a central program database that needs to be constructed for this. Assumptions around points of presence, so that we'll use points of presence to be able to reach out to applicants and provide places where applicants could come to if they are not able to do an application from their home or from their schools. We are aware, though, that there are a number of programs in place to provide digital access to students at schools in a way that is far more embracive than it is currently. Okay? So it is tied into that. And then assumption around the target launch date, and we talk about launching the actual formal establishment of the entity, the establishment of the board being one of the launches, the employment of the initial resources, and then ultimately culminating in the operational establishment. And it is intended, and I'll show that in the diagram here. We're intending a launch date for the first services to be available to a pilot group of institutions from the 1st of April 2019 to enable applications for the 2020 year of study. Okay, so it's a few years out still. Okay, but there's not a lot of time, and already there are some delays that have been crept in within DHET to take the processes to the next level. I'm going to flip through that. We have put out a first stab of what might be a potential sequence of institutions, with the KwaZulu-Natal universities being the first ones, partly because they're already on this kind of system, so it's a much easier migration from them. Then a group of ITS-based universities, mainly in Gauteng and in provinces surrounding, then a group of the balance of ITS versions, PeopleSoft, and other systems, and then in the longer term growing to other universities. We do recognize that the number of applications or the number of applicants are estimates based on overlap of applications. We know that some of you even have more applications currently than exist that are on here. So this is information that's probably 3 or 4 years old, but it's the best information that we could work with, and it's really to try to group into logical units. This is a first step. This is to be confirmed within the sector. This is by no means is this a definitive approach. We do recognize that some universities actually have indicated that if it's possible, can they be brought forward. Some have asked to be pushed back a bit. In terms of next step, the DHET has just issued a tender for business analysis and business requirements and functional specifications that would involve considerable consultation with each of the institutions to define all of this. That's due later this month. The legal process to establish the entity is starting soon. The policy framework, I think, is being published, and that's the first step in that process. And we are aware that at the regional communication sessions, nominations for user advisory groups were requested and will now be formally called for. So what DHET is looking for is formal representation from the universities and colleges to participate in the process of designing and ultimately establishing this entity. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I know this was kind of a whirlwind tour of the Central Application Service. I appreciate your time. I hope that you enjoyed the session. As I said, there is information available on the DHET website. I refer you to that. And I'm not sure if there are any 1 or 2 questions to handle right now.
Right, so I just have one question with regards to application fees and such. Seeing as each university, they charge fees per application, that's why it limits applicants as well. Are applicants going to pay one fee to apply to all the universities, or is there going to be a specific fee that will then restrict them in that sense?
So there is a restriction to the number of programs and institutions to apply to, but it is intended to be multiple applications for a single fee. Yep. There is some, again, we do recognize, for instance, that some applicants will only apply to university that's close to them, because that's what they can make it to. So the multiple institutions will be limited, but it is intended to be multiple. So if you say it failed and tried where? So I'm not aware of that. I am aware that there is currently in existence in KwaZulu-Natal a central application office. I'm not aware that there was a forcing of any institutions, other than there was an attempt at some point to bring on board UNISA, which I do acknowledge they failed because they took on more than they could chew. Our opinion is that the CAO, certainly from DHET perspective, is a voluntary entity, and could form the nucleus of this, but with significant support to enable it to actually happen. And that, we believe, was a stumbling block with broadening the CAO, is that it was trying to do this without necessarily the support and funding to enable it. And we've indicated significant funding requirements to make this happen.
Hello, Mark?
Yep.
My question relates to the funding aspect of things. The model that you have presented there is more hinged on a self-funding type of a thing, and a very dangerous assumption is placed there to say it's affordable rate, which is $200.
Yep.
Were aspects in terms of socio-economic differences within South Africa taken into consideration, considering the fact that in some households they live on less than 1,000 rands a month. So now you are charging $200 to say students come through. And understanding the discussion paper, I think, comes from learning strategies. You said this is to limit the number of applications and to control the applications. Aren't you defeating the purpose of actually trying what you're trying to achieve?
So, so, so the purpose. Let me try to answer that. The principle was one established by the um, by the department at the outset and before the Fees Must Fall campaign did start, which is why we wrote the position paper on a no application fee. We do believe that there are mechanisms to achieve a different way of funding. One is fully funded by the department, where no one pays. Okay, but we've made some suggestions where effectively fees could be waived for those applicants who qualify for instance, NSFAS funding, so that for those students who require the funding are identified, and if that's the case, well, then the fee is waived and the process continues. So I can't be more indicative than that at this point, because these are policy issues that the department is considering and that I'm not really mandated to talk to because no decisions have been made. But we do believe that there are practical ways to avoid a situation where applying is prohibited by virtue of fees to be paid.
Right, I think that's all the questions that we have time for. You'll be around at tea if people want to come and talk to you.
Sure.
Okay.
What time is
the next half an hour?
Next half an hour. Okay, that's fine. I could do that.
Okay,
I can't
great.
say too
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Appreciate your time. Thanks for coming to speak to us.